Hollywood movies love their visual conventions. That is the thing that audiences instantly understand without taking up any screen time or dialogue. For example, in the genre of cowboy films, good guys have white hats and bad guys have black hats. And in the 1950s, space movies quickly established a similar convention. Good guy humans travel in streamlined, bullet-shaped finned rockets which bear more than a passing resemblance to a German V2, which was the only rocket in the public consciousness in 1950. So if you saw such a rocket in the 1950s film, you would know to cheer on the plucky heroes as they went to the moon or Mars or wherever. Even today, it can still be used as a shorthand for the spaceship of an intrepid human adventurer. So much so that the British Interplanetary Society still base their logo around such a rocket, creating a source of controversy ever since. Why this controversy? Because it was known, even in 1950, that it was not a good design choice, as it was based on an incorrect assumption on the importance of streamlining, as shown when Wernher von Braun, who led the V2 team, was tasked with making an all-American version of it. He came up with the Redstone, and that looks very different, as it was incorporating all the don't do it this way lessons that he had learnt while developing the V2, including the dominating driver of structural efficiency over aerodynamic efficiency. So, this universal trope for a human rocket ship is based on just one rocket that got it wrong. But what about the bad guy aliens? Well, in the 1950s, it was obvious that interstellar travelling aliens would use these things. After all, they were being seen all over the skies after the war, and even if nobody could ever pin down some irrefutable proof, it was obvious that this is what they would use. And it works. You know what this is without any explanation on my part. Just as you know what this is without explanation, even though it also has no basis in reality. So whenever an audience, even today, sees a flying saucer in a movie, they understand what it is, and thus it became the genre standard spaceship for the interstellar travelling alien. But the film Forbidden Planet turned this convention on its head and asked the question, what if it were the humans who flew the flying saucers? Greetings and felicitations. I'm Mark Hempsell, an astronautical systems engineer, looking at how our cultural misperceptions of space and space flight are driven by space movies. And in this video, I shall explore the film Forbidden Planet, which was made by MGM in 1956. MGM did not make many space movies, but when they did, they were wow events and acclaimed successes. Well, okay, maybe not the last. And Forbidden Planet is a movie that is still justly famous for Robbie the Robot, and Francis mini dresses, and the purloining of the basic story from Shakespeare's Tempest. Well, let's kick off by addressing that last point, which is often raised as if it's some sort of a problem that detracts from the merit of the end result. But many other offerings from both stage and films similarly borrow a core story from the Bard of Avon, often to great effect. And such detractors forget that Shakespeare himself had nicked all his stories from somebody else in the first place. But knowing the Tempest influenced the story is hardly a spoiler, as it in no way prepares you for how the narrative unfolds, which is both clever and thought-provoking with a surprising twist. When combined with the meticulous care taken with the overall production values, exploiting MGM's big studio capabilities, it makes it the first movie that I've looked at so far on this channel that I would unreservedly recommend to a modern audience as a worthy piece of entertainment that holds up pretty much as well as it did when it was released. Which is a surprise, as it is a dose of genuine science fiction. And being real science fiction is normally the death knell of a movie, especially as it ages. But what do I mean by science fiction here? Well, there have been many attempts at defining science fiction, particularly in a way that accurately separates it from science fantasy. So here, for what it's worth, is my attempt. Both genres create a story world where there are significant science, technical or social differences from the real world that imbue the aesthetic of the work. Science fiction is when the basics of the story focus on the story world's differences and explores the implications of them. Whereas science fantasy is where the story focuses on the human characters and their development, and the story world is just an exotic background. The key way to distinguish them is to ask whether you need to have any understanding of the story world differences to appreciate the overall story. For example, to understand the film Arrival, you have to first understand the basic premise behind the story, which is how language shapes how we view and comprehend the world around us. It's not scientifically possible in the real universe, but that does not stop it being science fiction, because if you do not get the premise, the story is incomprehensible nonsense. But if Star Wars had sonic battle clubs or infrared rapiers, the story would be the same. All the stuff from the Force to hyperspace travel is just magic that you do not need to understand to fully appreciate the story. It's science fantasy. It means that appreciating true science fiction can be a rather cerebral rather than an emotional activity. And as a result, the characters and storylines can be a bit thin. So I must confess that I am not a great fan of science fiction when taken in large doses of the more mediocre offerings, much to the surprise of many of my friends and colleagues who revel in the stuff. It's my observation that real science fiction fans are gripped by the concepts the stories explore. And all of this plot and character development stuff that normal human beings expect is just a distraction that gets in the way. But is this why science fiction rarely makes for a successful popular movie? Now, with my highly developed psychic powers, I can feel the comment section lighting up with comments along the lines of What About Forbidden Planet or 2001 or Blade Runner. All are clearly science fiction by my definition, and all are widely admired. Indeed, all three are preserved in the National Film Registry of the Library of Congress as being culturally, historically or aesthetically significant. And in these cases, it's all three. However, none of these films were large box office successes when they came out. Their well-deserved reputations as some of the greatest and most influential movies ever made came later, as their groundbreaking merit was appreciated. But this was only after marinating in hindsight. And the suits who finance films will take rapid, healthy profit over being preserved for posterity every day of the week and twice on Sundays. Whereas by contrast, if you take undeniable science fantasy movies, such as Star Wars or the Marvel superhero movies or Avatar, they all made massive amounts of money very quickly at the box office and through merchandising. And they became the biggest movie franchises of all time. But before jumping to a case closed conclusion, let us consider Avatar. Is it really undeniable science fantasy? There are science-ish premises in the world building, and the story is to some extent founded on those premises. But do you need to understand them to appreciate good guys, bad guys battles? Which is a pretty standard story regardless of the genre. I think despite my best efforts, my definitions, like all others that try to separate science fiction from science fantasy, end up with a large grey area, where it is very subjective as to where a novel or a film belongs. A lot depends on the individual. And there is certainly no general audience perception about what is science fiction and what is science fantasy. Indeed, by far the majority of the cinema-going audience are not even aware that there are these two categories, let alone have any notions about what distinguishes them. And even if they do know, do they care? A point I think that is made clearer by a couple of other recent films that are undeniably science fiction and also have been great financial successes. And I have to say with very good reason. But there is still a science fiction box office problem. Here are three more recent movies, all science fiction and all have real merit. Yet their box office returns are hardly what investors would have wanted. Remember, the production budget is typically about half the total cost of getting a film released, so nobody's making any serious money here. So what's going on? If we ignore whether they are science fiction or science fantasy and just look at how human-centric the story is, specifically how it focuses on an individual whose character develops in response to the plot, we have a close correlation with the strength of this human story and the movie's success. So pure science fiction works if you remember to add good character and plot development, the very thing that the Golden Age authors revelled and gloried in avoiding. With that in mind, I would be concerned about the promised film adaptation of Rendezvous with Rama. If they stick to the novel, I would not be predicting any massive box office success. And if they don't, then there's going to be howls of anger and derision from the die-hard Clark aficionados. But this human-centric theory of success raises the question as to why Forbidden Planet was not more successful. Yes, it's fundamentally a cerebral science fiction story, but it is also human-centric, as the main characters, Morbius, played by Walter Pidgeon, and his daughter Altera, played by the delectable Anne Francis, each in their own ways discover they cannot escape the consequences of their humanity as they are faced with the brave new world. So why didn't it set the box office alight? Well, I think it's due to the cultural background. By 1956, science fiction, and particularly space films, were an established genre of low budget, low production standards, black and white movies full of bug-eyed monsters and scantily clad young ladies, primarily aimed at the hormone-ridden young men market. Definitely not a genre that serious, respectable people would go to see, and Forbidden Planet was probably pre-tarnished by this perception which restricted its audience. And it's also why, with our modern sensibilities which are much more accepting of space fiction as a respectable entertainment, we can be more open to the movie as a work of art. Its merits mean that it became a noted influence for later movies, and it is still much admired. And 70 years later, I think we can still enjoy it as much as when it was released. As almost nothing in it dates it, the science premise and the story are essentially timeless. Also, the effects hold up well. They were nominated for an Oscar in 1957, although they lost out to Cecil B. DeMille's 10 Commandments. I would suggest that this is an object lesson in using the best specs available to their strengths, and thus keeping the effect looking convincing as time progresses. Here they cleverly marry the ground matte shots with real physical sets, and it never jars. The acting is typical 1950s fare, but quite watchable. But in one respect, the film did suffer from later history. The United Planet Starship C-57D has a young commander, John J. Adams, played by a 30-year-old Leslie Nielsen in his second film acting role and his first as lead. He plays Adams as a serious, earnest commander to the point of the zealous. The problem for modern audiences is that we're all on the edge of our seats waiting for the
"I am serious, and don't call me Shirley"
moment. Now, Commander John J. Adams, like so much of Forbidden Planet, became a prototype for Star Trek's Captain Kirk. And so we come to Star Trek, because the one thing that everybody knows about Forbidden Planet is that it was a major inspiration, to the point of being a source for Gene Roddenberry when he first developed the original TV show. They had the same basic premise of a saucer-shaped starship with a pseudo-military crew exploring space beyond human civilization, while also representing the government of a unified planetary federation with an interstellar reach. And there are also many visual effects from Forbidden Planet which are echoed in Star Trek even if they are not always representing the same thing. So much is Forbidden Planet a Star Trek prototype, you would only need to change the ship's crew's names and maybe some of the technobabble, and you could use the script as a Star Trek film and no one would notice. There is, however, one thing you couldn't reuse while sticking to the Star Trek aesthetic, and that is the background sound. It is just too novel to the point of being weird. Notice that the credit here is for electronic tonalities. Why so? Well, Lewis and B.B. Barron, who created this soundtrack, were not members of the Musicians' Union, so it could not be called music. Apparently, if you're not a union member, you're not able to make music. And listening to my videos opening and closing tonalities, I'm sure many of you would agree. Originally, the newlywed Barons were commissioned to supply sound effects, but ended up providing a continuous track that mixes sound effects and music. So it's often not possible to distinguish what are in-world and out-of-world sounds, giving a very unsettling effect that moves us way past the use of the theremin that we saw in Rocket Ship XM. And I cannot recall another major film that has moved its music this far into the avant-garde. So if you are a film music buff, it's worth watching for the electronic tonalities alone. Another innovation is the introduction of a robot into a space movie. That is, if you don't count The Day the Earth Stood Still.
Welcome to Altair 4, gentlemen. I am to transport you to the residence. If you do not speak English, I am at your disposal with 187 other languages along with their various dialects and sub-tongues.
Although I think we could reasonably question Robbie's supposed intelligence. Consider, he is helpfully informing any non-English speakers that he can speak 187 other languages. In English. Although, to be fair, this is pretty typical behaviour for native English speakers. Robots in space movies are very rare until the 1970s, partly because they blow the film's production budget. But by the mid-1970s, having an anthropomorphic robot on a spaceship became a legal requirement, a perversion that I will further address when we get to those movies. However, robots aside, Forbidden Planet had a much more profound impact on the human perception of what the colonisation of space will be like. At the start of the film, we're given a potted history of the human expansion into the galaxy.
In the final decade of the 21st century, men and women in rocket ships landed on the moon. By 2200 AD, they had reached the other planets of our solar system. Almost at once, there followed the discovery of hyperdrive, through which the speed of light was first attained and later greatly surpassed. And so at last, mankind began the conquest and colonization of deep space.
Well, in hindsight, a moon landing at the end of the 21st century, over 130 years away, seems rather funny, given that Apollo 11 was in fact only 13 years away. But I guess it puts the story safely far away, so that it is outside any current world assumptions that the audience might make. And I note they use the word conquest, a favourite of the era, although it is never quite clear who is being conquered. But it does set up the concept that if your navy of interstellar ships is big enough, you can create a galaxy-wide empire with a common economy and a common political structure, a notion that is fundamental to space opera, and a universal trope in all space movies. But in every case, the interstellar spaceships are just a piece of techno-magic, and no more real than magic carpets, and they are serving the same function in the story. Indeed, this is a notion at the very heart of what I am calling fairy space. That is Hollywood's fantasy genre space, which our culture takes as being real space. Now, Forbidden Planet did not create this space opera concept. It was already a widely used trope in written science fiction. but it was the first to put it onto the silver screen, and to do so with such conviction that humanity generally seems to be unable to see it for the fantasy that it is. And therein lies my problem with the film. When I consider how it influenced our perception of space and our place within it, this movie inadvertently did a lot of damage. It takes a fantasy perception of the possible, which, like fairyland in fairy tales, is a wonderful place in which to set stories, and then sells it as the real universe. So in the final analysis, it is a tale set in a magical world which is just as unreal as the Tempest on which it was based. It's a good story, and well imagined, and still a great watch. Just don't go thinking that one day flying saucers are going to take humans to the stars with the ease of taking a voyage on a cruise ship.